Charles Fraser. Death on Christmas Day. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 2. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production. Well, Alice, I must say, you have truly outdone yourself. Sherlock Holmes set his cutlery aside and dabbed his mouth with his napkin before sliding deeper into his chair and leaning back, satiated and content. It was Christmas Eve to be precise. Alice and her husband, Eddie Miller, had invited Sherlock Holmes to the traditional Christmas dinner. The table was set festively. The tablecloth gleamed in bright white, adorned with small fir branch arrangements. The candles were lit, and the fine silver cutlery was in its proper place. Thus, Holmes sat in the dining room of his new landlord's and reached for his well-filled whisky glass. "Mr. Holmes, thank you. Would you perhaps like another helping of plum pudding, with brandy?" "My dear Alice, as much as I would like to." Holmes raised both hands in refusal. Alice giggled softly and handed Mr. Holmes his pipe. Sherlock Holmes accepted it gratefully. "Alice, Eddie, do tell me, have you any plans for the holidays? Are you expecting visitors?" "Oh, no," said Eddie, stroking his prominently rounded belly with one hand whilst pulling his wife Alice closer with the other. "We're going to have a cosy time. And you? What are your plans?" Sherlock Holmes took a deep draw from his briar pipe and blew little smoke rings. "You must know, these holidays mean nothing to me. Just another day like any other." With a wink, he looked at Alice. "The only exception, of course, being your excellent dinner." Alice's cheeks turned a delicate shade of pink. She smiled at Holmes, flattered. The three of them were suddenly torn from their peaceful atmosphere when there was a thunderous knock at the window pane. Eddie jumped up, ran to the window and quickly opened it, presumably out of fear that it might shatter from the sheer force. "I say, sir, I'm already here. What could be so terribly urgent?" A small, delicately built man in his mid-50s stood trembling outside the window, dressed in an elegant coat and scarf, with his hat pulled low over his face, looking around searchingly. "Are you the famous detective Sherlock Holmes?" "No, I'm afraid I must disappoint you." Eddie stepped aside and revealed Sherlock Holmes. "May I introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes? But do come in first, good man." Eddie promptly closed the window and was instantly on his way to the door, already holding it open for the unannounced visitor. "It's bitterly cold out there today." The small man shuddered meaningfully and removed his hat from his head. Mr. Holmes reached for his cane, stepped towards the man and offered his hand. "Sherlock Holmes, what can I do for you? But please, do take a seat first." Holmes gestured towards one of the empty chairs and sat down himself. Alice was already in the process of pouring another glass of whisky and handed it to the stranger. He didn't need to be asked twice and took a hearty sip before speaking. "My name is Lord John Greenwhich." Before he could continue speaking, Eddie jumped up, took Lord Greenwich's hand and dropped into an awkward curtsy. "Lord Greenwich, it is an honour." Sherlock Holmes gave Eddie a stern look before turning back to the Lord. "Please do continue. What matter brings you to me on Christmas Eve?" Lord Greenwich withdrew his hand from Eddie and cleared his throat awkwardly before continuing. "My elderly father has fallen victim to a vile attack. You must come with me at once." Holmes raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Now, let's take this slowly and start from the beginning. What makes you think your father was the victim of an assassination attempt? When did he pass away?" "That's precisely why you must come with me quickly. He isn't dead yet," Lord Greenwich exclaimed excitedly. "He's dying. A doctor is with him right now. Unfortunately, we don't know what's wrong with him." Sherlock Holmes immediately reached for his cane and stood up. "That certainly changes matters. Let us not waste any time. Where is your carriage?" "But how do you know that I have a carriage waiting?" Lord Greenwich asked, confused. As Holmes slipped into his coat and reached for his hat, he explained, "Firstly, you are a wealthy man, Mr. Greenwich, and secondly, when we met you, you did not look as though you had been wandering about in the snow on foot for very long. This suggests that your carriage is waiting nearby. Mr. Holmes, you are my man. Lord Greenwich extended his arm to Sherlock Holmes. But Mr. Holmes, Alice held him back. Shouldn't Eddy rather accompany you? Sherlock Holmes turned to Alice. For the time being, that won't be necessary. Should I require his esteemed presence, I shall send for him. But Alice wasn't giving up that easily. Very well, Mr. Holmes. If we don't hear from you in the next 2 days, Eddy will pop round to check if there's anything he can do for you. Isn't that right, Eddy? Eddy nodded obediently and bid farewell to the two men. Once Lord Greenwich and Sherlock Holmes had taken their seats in the carriage, and the former had spread the fine cashmere blanket across his lap, the team of horses galloped through London's deserted streets. Very well. Holmes cleared his throat audibly. Bring me up to speed. Lord Greenwich folded his hands over his covered lap and began to tell his story. My dear father is now 86 years old. His general health hasn't been the best in recent months, and we all know that this will be the last Christmas we'll spend together. Given the circumstances, even my sister Elaine has travelled from Paris. We spent a few peaceful days together. Well, this afternoon, when my father had retired for his nap, our maid Melinda suddenly came into the drawing room quite agitated, reporting that my father was complaining of severe pain. Naturally, we sent for the doctor immediately. Since then, both he and my dear sister haven't left his side. Unfortunately, my father's condition continues to deteriorate, and the esteemed Dr. Statson suggested food poisoning. However, since we can completely rule this out, as we all ate the same food, the doctor took me aside, admitted his bewilderment, and ventured to suggest some other form of poisoning. And this is where you come in. I've been following your career for quite some time. Back then, when you were solving one case after another with Dr. Watson. Those days are not today, good Lord Greenwich. Sherlock Holmes's features hardened. The young lord continued, You are a true master detective, and if anyone can shed light on this matter and still save my father's life, it would be you. The manor house of his lordship shone brightly in the upmarket district of Mayfair. When the carriage finally came to a halt, and Sherlock Holmes, assisted by the diminutive lord, climbed the few steps to the entrance, they were anxiously greeted by an elderly female servant. Lord Greenwich, come quickly, your dear father. He's taken a turn for the worse. Lord Greenwich released Sherlock Holmes's arm and hurried through the entrance, up the stairs to the first floor. Holmes remained briefly on the steps, his gaze sweeping over the estate and entrance hall, before another arm was offered to him. I am Melinda, the housemaid, and you must be Mr. Holmes, whom the young lord has been seeking. May I escort you upstairs? That is most kind of you, Melinda. Melinda escorted Holmes to the old lord's chamber door, which stood slightly ajar. She knocked hesitantly before entering with Holmes at her side, and immediately offered her assistance to the doctor. Old Lord Greenwich lay motionless in bed, whilst Dr. Statson carefully palpated his stomach, before the poor elderly gentleman was once again seized by violent nausea. Melinda swiftly appeared with a bowl, while another woman, in her early 50s, wiped his forehead with a damp flannel. This must be Sister Elaine, Holmes thought to himself. She tenderly helped her father rest his head back against the pillows. Concerned, young Lord Greenwich turned to Holmes. Mr. Holmes, may I make the introductions? My poor father in bed here. This is the attending physician, Dr. Statson, my sister Elaine, and our dear soul Melinda, whom you've already met. Holmes nodded silently to the sister and the doctor. Doctor, what can you tell me about your patient? Dr. Statson shook his head worriedly. The lord's condition is deteriorating by the hour. He's showing signs of poisoning. His abdomen is rock hard, and he has vomited 3 times now. Here, see for yourself. The doctor held out the bowl of vomit for Sherlock Holmes to examine. Interesting! Holmes wrinkled his nose imperceptibly and closely inspected the coffee-ground-like bloody vomit. Then his gaze fell upon the bed. He took a seat in the chair at the head of the bed, grasped the clammy hand of the man lying there, and whispered softly, Lord Greenwich, my name is Sherlock Holmes. Can you hear me? The old Lord Greenwich briefly opened his eyes, blinked twice before closing them again. "Can you tell me anything about your condition?" Holmes looked hopefully at the old man, but waited in vain for an answer. "Mr. Holmes, with all due respect, our poor father is far too weak and unwell to answer your questions," his daughter Elaine interjected. Holmes turned away from the old man and fixed his daughter with a piercing stare. "In that case, may I direct my questions to you instead?" Elaine nodded. "Very well then. Perhaps you can explain why your father has small cuts on his lips." Elaine leaned over her father. "To me, it looks more like he bit himself. Doctor, you would agree with me, would you not, that this could have happened whilst he was vomiting?" Dr. Statson examined his patient's lips intently. He shrugged briefly before responding. "One cannot confirm this with certainty. Lord Greenwich's lips are dry and chapped. However, I most agree with the missus. After all, why else would there be cuts on his lordship's lips?" The old lord began to moan again. Once more, his daughter wiped the sweat from his forehead. Holmes turned to the young lord, who was standing a little way off with a worried expression, looking sympathetically at his father. "Lord Greenwich, would it be possible to have a quiet word?" The young lord, torn from his thoughtful worries about his father, gestured Holmes towards the door. "Of course. Please follow me to the drawing-room. Melinda, would you bring me a cup of tea? I think I could do with one now. Mr. Holmes, would you care for one as well?" "Yes, please." Holmes followed his host closely. The two gentlemen took their seats in the drawing-room. It was magnificently furnished and showed excellent taste. Flames flickered in the fireplace. Together with the cup of tea that Melinda brought them, accompanied by some biscuits, a comforting warmth slowly spread through Holmes. He stretched out his aching knee before addressing young Lord Greenwich. "Tell me, has there been any change in your household lately? New servants? Any visitors? New suppliers? Has anything strange occurred? Tell me everything, no matter how insignificant it may seem to you." Lord Greenwhich pondered for a brief moment before shaking his head. "No, there's nothing I could tell you about. Apart from my sister's visit, there haven't been any noteworthy events." "Your sister?" asked Holmes. "Is it so extraordinary that she visits you? Is your relationship not on the best of terms?" No, you misunderstand. My relationship with Elaine is, I would say, normal. However, we last saw each other 11 years ago. That was at Mother's death. She came to the funeral. When Mother was still alive, she visited more regularly, about 2 or 3 times a year. After all, the journey from Paris to London isn't exactly short, and my sister has always complained about the hardships of travelling. About 8 years ago, her husband suddenly passed away. Since then, as far as I know, she's led quite a reclusive life. "Is your sister wealthy?" asked Holmes. "My sister married the well-to-do Etienne Durand at the time. Financial difficulties were unknown to my sister. However, when her husband died, she inherited nothing but debts. Poor Etienne's ill-advised investments had led him into this precarious situation. And you've been supporting her since then?" "That's correct. However, we're not talking about an enormous sum here. I say, you wouldn't happen to have a photograph of your mother at hand, would you?" The young lord was visibly astonished by Holmes's question. "But of course, do come with me, Mr. Holmes." Deliberately, Sherlock Holmes rose from the sofa and straightened his knee. It ached, as it often did at this late hour. Limping, he followed the young lord who led Holmes to his private chambers. There, he was immediately struck by the pretty dark-haired woman who smiled at him from the oil painting on the wall. She was still young in the painting, which showed her as a Rubenesque half-figure. "You don't look much like your mother, if I may make that observation." "You may say so." Lord Greenwhich smiled gently and gazed lovingly at the portrait. "She wasn't my birth mother. My birth mother died shortly after I was born." "So that means you and Elaine are half-siblings?" "Quite right, sir." "My dear lord, tell me about today. How did you spend your day?" Lord Greenwich pondered for a moment. "After rising, I spent my time exclusively in my private quarters. Until just before 11 o'clock, I was absorbed in my reading. Then my sister and I arrived in the drawing room. Father was wheeled in by Elaine. We began brunch and chatted about past Christmases when Mother was still alive. "What did you eat?" "Oh, nothing out of the ordinary. We had fruit, jam, toast, scrambled eggs with either bacon or crab, baked beans in sauce and soup. For dessert, Elaine and I had orange ice cream." "Your father didn't have any dessert?" Holmes asked with interest. "Yes, he did. Elaine brought it up to his room a bit later. He retired somewhat earlier. It was becoming rather tiring for him. Our brunch went on longer than usual because we were exchanging stories about the old days." "And when your father retired to his room, could you say he was already feeling unwell at that point? Did he mention feeling poorly, or perhaps having stomach pains?" Holmes pressed on. "No, as I said, he was just getting tired, but otherwise had no complaints." Suddenly, there was an impatient knock at the door. "Yes," replied Lord Greenwhich, glancing towards the door. "Melinda, what is it?" "It's your father, Lord Greenwhich." The old Lord Greenwich was tormented by severe cramps. Time and again, his body curled into a fetal position as he clutched his stomach with both hands. He had developed a fever and began sweating profusely. Elaine continued to dab the excessive perspiration from his forehead. Holmes discreetly withdrew to a corner of the spacious room and observed the scene. The young Lord Greenwich knelt at his father's bedside, holding his hand. Dr. Statson administered a morphine injection to his pain-stricken patient. Moments later, it took effect. Lord Greenwich, utterly exhausted, sank into his pillow, closed his eyelids, and drifted into a light sleep. Visibly distressed, the young Lord Greenwich buried his head in his hands, while his sister took her place at the head of the bed. Sherlock Holmes looked around the room. In the furthest corner, directly beneath the large window, stood the old lord's oversized bed. A spacious wardrobe opposite housed the old gentleman's attire. Holmes himself sat in a comfortable armchair. Before him stood a small table with various light reading materials. 2 additional armchairs encircled the small table. To Holmes's right stood a large glass cabinet. Inside were presumably various collectibles from past travels. On top stood 11 ornate wine glasses in neat formation. Suddenly Holmes addressed Elaine. "Lady Greenwich or Mrs. Durand, how may I address you? I see you have already made inquiries about me. I am not the lady of this house," she replied with a slightly bitter tone. "Mrs. Durand is quite correct." "Very well, Mrs. Durand. Would you be so kind as to accompany an old man to the drawing-room? Another cup of tea before retiring would do me, and certainly you as well, a world of good." Reluctantly, Elaine rose and followed Holmes. "I'm rather loath to leave my father, you understand." "Oh, absolutely, especially since you haven't seen him for 11 years, Holmes added with a sarcastic undertone. Sherlock Holmes sat down with Elaine in the drawing-room, just as he had done earlier with young Lord Greenwich. Melinda brought freshly brewed tea and set it down before the gentlefolk. "How is it that you did not travel to London for so long to visit your father and brother?" Holmes posed the question to Elaine. "Well, when my mother died, she was my main support, you must understand. I was initially in deep mourning for her. When my beloved husband passed away 3 years later, and I discovered that he had left me nothing but a pile of debts, my means for such a journey were extremely limited." "But your brother sent you money every month, did he not?" "That's correct." Elaine fidgeted nervously with the bow on her dress. "But there wasn't much left of that money if one wanted to maintain some semblance of one's former social standing and afford at least a housemaid, a cook, and a caretaker." "Of course I understand. And if I may ask, how did you pay for this journey?" "It's really none of your business, but I can tell you that my brother sent for me. He wanted to celebrate Christmas with the family one last time. It's likely Father's last celebration, as he put it." "We can safely assume that at this point," declared Holmes, "you brought dessert to your father's room this afternoon." "That's correct." "What was your father's general condition at that time?" "My father had already retired earlier. When I went to see him, he was already complaining of severe stomach pains." "If that was the case, did he even eat his dessert, Holmes inquired. No, he did not. How come your father has stains from the orange sorbet on his shirt collar? He only tried 2 small spoonfuls. That's when he doubled over with severe stomach cramps. That must have been when the little mishap occurred, concluded Elaine. Mrs. Durand, your brother, who, by the way, told me beforehand that your father wasn't in any pain at the time, showed me your mother's portrait. A remarkably beautiful woman, if you'll permit me to say so. A dark-haired stunner, as they might say in certain parts of London. Elaine raised her eyebrows indignantly. And your brother, the spitting image of his father, the fair hair, the slight build, the aristocratic nose. Mr. Holmes, what exactly are you trying to tell me? Elaine glared pugnaciously at Sherlock Holmes. Well, Mrs. Durand, you are neither dark-haired nor blonde. A delightful shade of red frames your well-proportioned face, which completely lacks a distinctive aristocratic nose. Elaine's green eyes sparkled dangerously. Mr. Holmes, a well-meant piece of advice from me. As you've likely noticed yourself, these are not good days for elderly people in this house. Are you threatening me? Holmes's tone and demeanour didn't change in the slightest. He had experienced this sort of thing far too often. Elaine's voice took on an unusual gentleness. Mr. Holmes, I believe you've completely misunderstood something. It's been a long, exhausting day, and you'll have to excuse me. I shall retire now, which, by the way, I would most warmly recommend you do as well. And in that, she was actually right. Holmes sought out Melinda and had her show him to his room. Holmes lay fully dressed on his bed, staring at the ceiling and lost in thought. Time and again, he heard the pain-filled groans of old Lord Greenwhich, whose room was right next door to his. Sherlock Holmes wished his old friend Dr. Watson was by his side. He would examine the case from a medical perspective. He might still be able to help the poor old man, even if only to ease his suffering a little more. In the early hours of the morning, the old lord's condition worsened considerably. Bloody stools and vomiting joined hands with the high fever, causing the elderly gentleman to endure unimaginable suffering. The young Lord Greenwhich glided like a shadow through the corridors, and one could see how deeply his father's suffering affected him. His sister Elaine, however, remained steadfast and only left her place at her father's bedside for brief visits to the lavatory. Mr. Holmes inquired several times during the day about the elderly lord's state of health. However, one glance into the darkened room was enough to know that it would only be, or, thank God, a matter of hours. He took afternoon tea with young Lord Greenwhich when the latter turned hopefully to Holmes. Mr. Holmes, have you discovered anything yet? I hardly dare to hope, but is there anything I can do to help my father? Sympathetically, Sherlock Holmes patted Lord Greenwich's arm. My good man, stay by your father's side, just as you have done until now. Ensure that the doctor alleviates his pain as much as possible. I'm afraid there's nothing more to be done. Lord Greenwich let Sherlock Holmes's words sink in for a moment before collecting himself and asking, But do you know what my father was poisoned with? And by whom? Your father was not poisoned, but cruelly murdered, and I also know by whom. Completely baffled, Lord Greenwich jumped up and demanded more information. Holmes, however, said, All in good time. Accompany your father on his final journey. It is an extremely arduous and trying one. Afterwards, I shall inform you of everything worth knowing. Holmes reached for his walking stick, rose and said, I am terribly sorry, before leaving the room and retiring to his chambers. Shortly before midnight, Sherlock Holmes was informed by Melinda that Lord Greenwich was nearing his end. Holmes entered the room, which was thick with the foul stench of vomit and excrement. His 2 children stood by his side, each for their own reasons, Holmes thought to himself. Dr. Statson administered one final injection, meant to provide relief, but which sent Lord Greenwich into another world. Lord Greenwich's heart beat its last. His 2 children fell into each other's arms, tearfully. Mr. Holmes left the room at this emotional sight. Sherlock Holmes began the next day by gathering the young Lord Greenwich and his sister Elaine in the drawing-room. Melinda served a modest breakfast, consisting of tea, soft-boiled eggs, and marmalade on toast. "Before we begin breakfast," Holmes announced, "allow me to express my sincere condolences to you both." The young Lord Greenwich nodded in gratitude with his head bowed. Elaine looked directly at Holmes with a challenging gaze. Sherlock Holmes stirred his cup unperturbed and reached for a piece of toast. "Would you care for some too, Mrs. Durand?" he asked, offering her the plate of toast. She declined. Unperturbed, Holmes continued. "Did you sleep well?" Elaine snapped angrily at Holmes. "What do you think? Our father died yesterday. How could anyone sleep well under such circumstances?" "You have a point there. Moreover, it is a disgrace how your dear father had to depart this world. Isn't that right, Mrs. Durand?" Elaine did not reply. Only Lord Greenwich looked back and forth between Holmes and Elaine in bewilderment. "Very well. I believe we owe it to your father to raise a toast to him. Melinda, would you be so kind as to fetch the finest bottle of wine you can find, and bring those splendid glasses that I spotted on the glass cabinet in Lord Greenwich's chamber?" Elaine Durand turned deathly pale. "Mr. Holmes, don't you think it's a bit too early for that?" she stammered. "No, not at all. It's high time justice was served." The young Lord Greenwich looked questioningly at Holmes. "What do you mean by that? How am I to understand this?" "You'll understand shortly," replied Holmes. "I promise you that. But surely not the good crystal glasses. Melinda, bring the glasses we always use." "No, Melinda." Holmes's voice had a slightly smug, yet brooking no argument undertone. "Bring the glasses I told you about. And Melinda, bring the entire collection." Elaine jumped up and excused herself, saying, "I'll help Melinda with the glasses. We wouldn't want any accidents to happen." Holmes let her do as she pleased. "Mr. Holmes, what exactly is happening here?" Lord Greenwich looked expectantly at Sherlock Holmes. "And why is my sister behaving so strangely? What game is being played here?" But before Sherlock Holmes could begin to answer, they heard a loud crash in the hallway. "Oh no, father's precious heirloom glasses!" Lord Greenwich cried in horror, jumped up and ran out into the hallway. Sherlock Holmes followed hot on his heels. Melinda and Elaine were both kneeling on the floor, gathering up the shards and trying to salvage what could no longer be saved, whilst Elaine scolded, "Do watch where you're going, you clumsy thing!" Melinda sobbed desperately. "But madam, it wasn't my fault. I beg your pardon, but you literally ran straight into me." Sherlock Holmes approached Melinda and patted her shoulder. "It's not your fault, my dear. Don't worry about it." Bravely, Melinda continued gathering up the shards, whilst a tear rolled down the cheek of the faithful soul. Then Holmes turned to the siblings. "Lord Greenwich, Mrs. Durand, please follow me back to the drawing-room." When the three had taken their seats, Lord Greenwich deathly pale, his sister Elaine with a satisfied expression, Holmes spoke. "Mrs. Durand, your little performance was all very well, but I think it's time to get down to brass tacks. Would you like to tell your brother everything, or shall I?" "I wouldn't know what there is to tell, except that the old housemaid is a clumsy oaf," Elaine retorted snippily. "But Elaine," the young Lord Greenwich scolded, "how can you speak about Melinda like that?" Then he turned to Sherlock Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I'm all ears." "Very well." Sherlock Holmes took another sip of his tea before continuing. "Elaine, you deliberately caused Melinda to drop your father's heirloom glasses." "How dare you!" cried Elaine in horror as she jumped to her feet. Holmes, meanwhile, continued unperturbed. "You'd better sit down again. My conclusion will take a while longer, so, if you would be so kind." Elaine sat down again with contempt. Holmes continued. "You smashed the glasses to conceal that only 11 pieces remained. A set consists of either 6 or 12 glasses. These glasses are around 250 years old, and I don't think it was any different back then." Elaine immediately interjected. "I have no idea how many glasses there were, but even if there were 11, couldn't one have been broken in years past? What nonsense are you talking about?" "Mr. Holmes, I must agree with my sister," Lord Greenwich interjected. "Besides, what do these glasses have to do with our father's death? I don't understand you." But Lord Greenwich," You will understand when you let me finish my explanation." Then Holmes turned back to Elaine. "Mrs. Durand, I completely agree that it would have been quite possible for a glass to have broken over the years. However, it hasn't, and I can prove it. Let us go to your father's room and you will notice that there are 12 equally sized marks free from any dust. This proves that until recently, all 12 glasses were still in their place. However, when I sat in the armchair 2 days ago and looked around, I noticed there were only 11 glasses left. So what happened to the 12th glass?" "Perhaps someone simply used it and didn't put it back," said Elaine. "No, that cannot be," Lord Greenwhich interjected. "Father wouldn't even tolerate anyone coming near the glasses. He even dusted and polished them himself." "I'll tell you what happened to the 12th glass," said Sherlock Holmes. "The glass is the murder weapon." Both siblings exclaimed simultaneously. "The murder weapon! What on earth are you talking about?" "Indeed, someone broke the glass and made your father swallow the shards." Lord Greenwich turned quite pale around his aristocratic little nose. "Mr. Holmes, this all sounds rather far-fetched. I cannot imagine that someone would feed glass to my father and that he would simply swallow it without batting an eyelid. And anyway, who could possibly be guilty of such a thing? To answer your questions in order, dear Lord Greenwich, allow me to establish the following. Your father was brutally murdered. It had to happen quickly and wasn't meant to look like murder. And I believe he was put under massive pressure not to reveal his murderer. I think he was threatened that you would be next if he did." Lord Greenwhich turned even paler and swallowed audibly. Holmes continued impassively. "Now to your questions. The glass was the only object in your father's room suitable as a murder weapon. The killer shattered it and mixed it into the orange ice cream. This way, the individual shards were easier to swallow. Your father didn't submit to this easily, of course, as proven by the cuts on his lips. "But for heaven's sake, who on earth could it have been?" Lord Greenwich cried out in agitation. "As we know, your sister Elaine brought your father the dessert." "My sister!" Lord Greenwhich turned completely pale. "On the contrary," Elaine replied calmly, "I beg you, this is ridiculous. What reason could I possibly have had to attempt to take my father's life?" "I can tell you the reason, Mrs. Durand," Holmes explained. "Lord Greenwich wasn't your father at all. You found that out from him on that afternoon of the 24th of December. I believe you had already suspected it yourself, or did your mother reveal it to you before her death? That was, in any case, the reason why you hadn't been home for such a long time, until the invitation from your supposed brother arrived." "Elaine!" Lord Greenwich struggled to maintain his composure whilst Mrs. Durand sat with her head held high, observing Sherlock Holmes. "Mrs. Durand, you have just received irrevocable confirmation that you are not Lord Greenwich's daughter, and therefore have no inheritance rights. Should the young lord discover this as well, he would certainly discontinue his monthly allowances to you. Your only solution, the old lord must die and young Lord Greenwich must never learn of this. Or perhaps you even plan to murder him too and become the sole heir. But don't worry, I cannot prove this. These are mere speculations." Elaine Durand snorted indignantly. "Slander, nothing but baseless accusations." But Holmes continued. "One need not be a genealogist to notice that you, Mrs. Durand, are completely different in appearance. The Greenwiches are of delicate build with that unmistakable nose. You, Mrs. Durand, are of robust build, and your face is adorned with that button nose. Moreover, your red mop suggests that at least your father has red hair as well." Elaine Durand sat there silently for a moment. "Mrs. Durand," Holmes continued triumphantly, "I believe you have been caught out." The young Lord Greenwich sat pale and dejected in his seat. It seemed as though he couldn't quite comprehend what he had just heard. "What happens now?" he asked. "Should I send for Scotland Yard?" "That would probably be best," said Sherlock Holmes. "Stop right there!" Elaine suddenly exclaimed. "No one will be sent for." "My dear brother," she said with contempt, Tell Melinda to take the carriage to my house in Paris and fetch my remaining clothes and a few belongings. That way we'll be rid of that nosy Parker for a while, and she should take the cook with her as well." Holmes and Lord Greenwich looked at each other questioningly. "What do you mean by that, Miss Durand?" Holmes fixed his gaze sharply on Elaine and discreetly reached for his walking stick. His body was tense and ready to spring into action at any moment, but nothing escaped Elaine's notice. "Mr. Holmes, you'll stay right where you are." As she spoke, she reached into the inside of her petrol blue jacket and pulled out a small handgun from the pocket. She aimed it brazenly at Sherlock Holmes. Holmes raised both hands defensively, whilst Lord Greenwich gasped for breath. "Elaine, for God's sake!" he exclaimed excitedly. "Put that weapon down!" "Pah! I won't do any such thing. Do you two birds think I'll just let you lock me up? No, no, I've invested far too much in this affair to simply give up now." She waved the pistol about like a madwoman whilst keeping her eyes fixed on Holmes and Lord Greenwich. "Call for Melinda and tell her what I said." Elaine's weapon pointed directly at Lord Greenwich, adding some weight to her words. "Now!" Lord Greenwich's trembling voice called for Melinda. When she appeared immediately, she asked with concern, "My dear Lord, are you not feeling well? What may I bring you?" Lord Greenwich cleared his throat twice before daring to use his voice again. "Thank you, Melinda. I don't need anything. Pack your belongings immediately, have the carriage prepared, and make your way to my sister's house in Paris at once. Pack all your clothes and valuables and bring them here. Oh yes, and take Bertha, the cook, with you. She shall accompany you." Melinda was visibly irritated and asked, "But Lord Greenwich, I'll be away for several days. Who will look after you and cook for you if Bertha is to come along as well? Are you quite sure? And what about your father's funeral? We'll have guests in the house and—" Then Elaine interrupted her. "Did you not hear what his lordship said? Why are you still standing around here? Get going at once." Melinda nodded briefly and left the drawing room. "That exceptionally stupid thing," scolded Elaine. She leaned back contentedly, stretched out her legs and said, "Which of you gentlemen would be so kind as to pour me some more tea? We shall wait here in the drawing room until the servants have left the estate." About half an hour later, there was a timid knock at the door. Melinda entered, wearing a travelling skirt and bonnet. "We're ready to leave now. Would your lordship require anything else?" she asked, looking questioningly at Lord Greenwich. "No, Melinda, thank you. I wish you a pleasant journey. Take care of yourself." Elaine clapped her hands with satisfaction and rose. As she did so, she waved her weapon about again, first menacing Holmes, then Lord Greenwich with it. "Gentlemen, if you would be so kind, the three of us shall now proceed to the upper floor and to Lord Greenwich's chambers." Elaine herded the two men ahead of her to the upper floor and practically drove them into the Lord's room. After them, she locked the door and called out to Holmes and Lord Greenwich, "I need time to think. You can both make splendid use of this time for a little rest." "My dear brother," she said ironically, "you look like you could do with a little nap, and you, dear Mr. Holmes, at your age, a short break is always welcome, isn't it?" And then she was gone. Locked in, the two men remained behind. Holmes was the first to compose himself. He briefly looked around the Lord's room and decided to take a seat in the armchair. His knee was hurting. He tried to stretch it out completely when it immediately gave him an excruciating stab of pain. Lord Greenwich buried his head in his hands. He had sunk to the floor and was kneeling on the carpet. "What on earth are we to do? She's gone completely mad." "First, we must try to keep a cool head." Holmes stood up again, reached for his cane, and walked over to the window. His gaze swept across the grounds outside. Unfortunately, there was nothing to see but snow-covered gardens and trees. "Lord Greenwich, your stables are on the opposite side, are they not?" Lord Greenwich nodded. "Unfortunately." Holmes opened the window and leaned out. A cold draught swept through the room, giving their captivity an icy quality. Shortly after, Holmes pulled his head back in and closed the window with a shiver. "I had hoped to find something we could climb down on. But no, Besides, there isn't enough snow for a simple jump from the window. We would break every bone in our bodies. I would probably break 1 or 2 more than you, Holmes joked. And now? What happens next? Lord Greenwhich sounded desperate. We mustn't lose heart. For the moment, we have no choice but to wait and see. The hours passed, and dusk had already set in. Elaine hadn't shown herself since they'd been locked in the room. Sherlock Holmes's stomach growled, and he grew visibly more restless. What wouldn't he have given for a few intoxicating puffs from his pipe? What do you think she's planning? Do you suppose she's already gone into hiding? Lord Greenwhich tore Holmes from his thoughts. My dear Lord Greenwhich, that would be the most preferable outcome. But to be perfectly honest, I don't believe that's the case. Mrs. Durand wants to inherit, after all. That's why the murder occurred in the first place. And if she goes into hiding now, there won't be any inheritance to speak of. No, I rather fear she's currently devising plans for how to dispose of us both in the most discreet and inconspicuous manner possible. Lord Greenwich audibly swallowed, and all colour drained from his face once again. Sherlock Holmes spoke to him encouragingly. Now, my dear fellow, we're not dead yet, and believe me, people have tried to dispose of me on numerous occasions. Suddenly, the men heard a key turning in the lock, and both looked anxiously towards the door. Elaine stood casually leaning against the door with a drawn weapon in her hand. Well, did the gentleman sleep well? She asked with a smile on her lips. Lord Greenwich's gaze searched desperately for Sherlock Holmes's. Holmes rose from his seat and looked at Elaine challengingly. Well, Miss Durand, since you are responsible for my extended stay, I would like to inform you that my fellow prisoner and I now wish to dine. Elaine burst out laughing. Mr. Holmes, you are quite something, but as it happens, that works out well. Whether you believe it or not, I've spent the last few hours cooking for you. May I ask you to follow me to the drawing room? Sherlock Holmes grabbed his cane and strode ahead with firm steps. Lord Greenwich followed hesitantly. Elaine brought up the rear with the pistol in her hand. In the drawing room, the table was indeed already set. Wine glasses were half filled, and in the deep bowls there was some sort of porridge-like substance. Sherlock Holmes studied the contents of the plate carefully and furrowed his brow. Elaine, would you believe me if I said you've truly outdone yourself with this? Elaine laughed out loud again. Mr. Holmes, with all due respect to your sarcasm, unfortunately, it won't be of much use to you soon either. With an inviting gesture, she offered both men a seat. Dinner is served. The two gentlemen reluctantly complied with her request. Sherlock Holmes took his fork in his right hand and carefully prodded at his food. Mrs. Durand, I really would have credited you with more imagination. Glass shards in the food. How terribly cliché. Lord Greenwich recoiled in horror. Mr. Holmes, this isn't unimaginative, but rather brilliant. They'll assume it was an infectious disease that first claimed the old lord and subsequently carried off both of you. What awaits you in your final hours has been quite impressively demonstrated by old Lord Greenwich. I don't suppose you'll be dabbing my forehead with a damp flannel, Holmes observed, unimpressed. Lord Greenwich stared stubbornly at the plate full of indefinable food mush, garnished with a few shards of glass mixed in. Well then, gentlemen, do enjoy your meal, Elaine urged Holmes and Lord Greenwich. This time, Sherlock Holmes laughed out loud. Surely you don't seriously believe, dear Miss Durand, that we would actually eat your, shall we say, gruel? Decisively, he pushed the plate far away from himself with his left hand. Oh yes, I do believe so, Mr. Holmes. Should you refuse, my little friend here, she waved her weapon around again, we'll have to come into play. Are you planning to put a bullet through our heads, or would you prefer to shoot us in the knee first, as a demonstration? I would advise against both. A bullet hole in the body would make the story of the infectious disease rather hard to sell, but I'm sure you've already considered that. Holmes leaned back thoughtfully and let his words sink in with Elaine. One could see the small glimmer of hope slowly and cautiously dawning in Lord Greenwich. You know, Mr. Holmes, when it comes down to it, I don't really care about you at all. I could even put a bullet through your head right now if I felt like it. There's nothing for me to inherit from you after all. I can also simply torture you until my dear brother here can't bear to watch any longer and voluntarily eats his little brew." Elaine appeared confident of victory. "And now, gentlemen, I suggest we end our pleasant debate about things I can and will do and proceed straight to action." Lord Greenwhich looked beseechingly at Sherlock Holmes. Elaine stepped towards Lord Greenwhich, taking the spoon in one hand, whilst continuing to threaten both men with the gun in her other hand. She stirred the porridge with the spoon, scooped up a portion, and lifted it right under the Lord's nose for him to taste. "Open wide, dear brother. Bon appétit." Lord Greenwhich stared at the spoon in front of him and swallowed hard. In his panic, he was almost about to open his mouth slightly. "Stop!" shouted Sherlock Holmes. "Are you mad, man? Don't do it!" Elaine Durand's patience appeared to be wearing thin. Furiously, she slammed the spoon onto the table, strode over to Holmes, and delivered a resounding slap across his face. "How dare you!" she screamed at him. Just at that moment, there was a vigorous knock at the window. "Quiet!" hissed Elaine. "Mr. Holmes? Mr. Sherlock Holmes? Are you in there somewhere?" Eddy's voice could be heard clearly. "Good old Eddy," thought Mr. Holmes, and not a moment too soon. "Who is that? What's he doing here?" Elaine glared at Holmes malevolently. "That's Eddy Miller. He works at Scotland Yard," Holmes lied. "Scotland Yard? What's he doing here?" Elaine wanted to know. "He knows I'm investigating here. He won't rest until he's spoken with me. Otherwise, he might easily turn up with half the force and tear your estate apart completely." Elaine seemed completely overwhelmed by the situation for a brief moment, yet she quickly regained her composure. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. You shall speak with this Mr. Miller." "As you wish, Miss Durand." "No, no, my dear fellow. No tricks. You'll go to the door and under no circumstances let the inspector in. Think of something proper to answer his questions and get rid of him as quickly as possible. Should you fail to do so, I'll put a bullet straight through my dear brother's head right here. I have nothing to lose, Mr. Holmes, as you're well aware. I'll be standing behind the door and will hear every single word." Sherlock Holmes nodded and made his way to the front door. At first, he opened it just a crack, then a bit wider, before calling out, "Inspector Miller, Inspector Miller, I'm here." It took a brief moment until Eddy heard Mr. Holmes and could locate the direction of the call. Mr. Holmes, there you are." Completely out of breath, Eddy arrived at Holmes, who was standing tensely in the doorway. "Yes, Inspector." Holmes winked at Eddy. "Here I am." "Inspector?" asked Eddy, and Holmes had been aware from the very beginning that Eddy wouldn't understand it straight away. "Yes, Inspector. I congratulate you once again on your promotion." It was a dangerous game that Holmes was playing here, but Eddy was their only chance at rescue. Oh, how he missed his friend Dr. Watson in moments like these. But now was not the time to fall into sentimentality. "Tell me, Eddy, how is Inspector Wolford? Is he still in critical condition?" Holmes saw the gleam in Eddy's eyes and knew that he understood. "Yes, he does, Mr. Holmes. I merely wanted to check on your well-being, but as I can see, you're in perfect order. I shall take my leave now and pay my respects to Inspector Wolford. I wish you a pleasant day." With that, Eddy turned on his heel, forcing himself to walk calmly and inconspicuously the few metres to the gate until he was out of sight, then suddenly broke into a run as fast as his legs could carry him. Satisfied, Sherlock Holmes closed the front door. Now he just had to buy enough time until Eddy could alert Inspector Wolford, and hopefully the latter would arrive quickly at their location. Suddenly, he was struck hard from behind. A sharp, piercing pain followed immediately. Elaine had rammed the pistol between his ribs and promptly repeated the action. "Inspector Wolford? Who is this man and why is he in mortal danger? And don't you dare make a fool of me!" Elaine screamed in fury, glaring dangerously at Holmes. "Do calm down. Inspector Wolford is Eddy's superior and was shot during his last assignment. If I hadn't asked about Wolford, it would have seemed suspicious. Believe me." In sheer rage, Elaine struck again. This time she landed a blow to Holmes's stomach. Sherlock Holmes doubled over in pain, momentarily struggling to catch his breath. Lord Greenwhich, who had meanwhile been tied to the chair and gagged, let out a sound of horror. Elaine had regained her composure. "Now, where were we?" "Ah, yes, we were about to feed Lord Greenwich his evening gruel." Mrs Durand removed the gag from Lord Greenwich and gestured for Holmes to sit down again. Once again, Elaine took the spoon in her hand and filled it with porridge. Then she moved it towards Lord Greenwich's mouth. "Here comes one for Daddy." "What a cold-hearted piece of rubbish you are! And I thought I knew you, that you were my sister." Tears of disappointment, helplessness and sorrow welled up in Lord Greenwich's eyes. "You pathetic little cry-baby," Elaine snorted with contempt. "And you call yourself a lord." Brutally, she rammed the spoon filled with glass shards into defenceless Lord Greenwich's mouth, giving him a resounding slap across the face to force him to swallow. Sherlock Holmes gathered his ageing strength, and with one bound was at Lord Greenwich's side. In one fluid motion, he swung his walking stick and delivered the long-deserved blow to Elaine Durand's flank. Elaine lost her balance, began to stagger, and dropped the pistol. Holmes noticed this a millisecond too late, for at the same moment both Holmes and Elaine lunged for the weapon simultaneously. A fierce scuffle ensued, Elaine screamed, and Holmes gasped. Suddenly, a bang. Both Elaine and Mr. Holmes froze mid-movement and looked at each other. Slowly, Elaine rose. She looked down at Sherlock Holmes, who still lay on the floor. Blood seeped through his shirt, his gaze still fixed on Elaine. The old man would be out of action for now. She smiled down triumphantly at Holmes, and then her gaze drifted back to young Lord Greenwich, who had meanwhile somewhat recovered from his coughing fit. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. "Scotland Yard, the house is surrounded. Drop your weapon." Elaine Durand stood stock still. Her hate-filled gaze returned to Holmes, who was still lying bleeding on the ground. "You lied to me, old man." She spun around and aimed her weapon at Lord Greenwich. "I'll take you to hell with me." With his last remaining strength, Holmes swung his arm. His walking stick struck Elaine's legs with full force, sweeping them from under her. "This one's for the slap," Holmes gasped. Then he gathered his strength once more. This time his cane struck Elaine directly on her posterior. "And that blow is for the old man." Then Holmes's strength left him, and he remained lying there, breathing heavily. "Mr. Holmes, you're finally awake." Eddy leaned anxiously over the old detective, whilst Alice sat beside his hospital bed, lovingly holding his hand. Holmes opened his eyelids with difficulty, immediately feeling a sharp, burning pain in his shoulder. He wanted to say something, but Alice gestured for him to remain quiet. "You're in hospital." Holmes reached for the painful spot on his shoulder with his free hand. Alice spoke again. "Stay calm. You've been shot. Fortunately, it's a clean through-and-through wound. It will heal soon." "And Lord Greenwich?" Holmes whispered. "Don't worry about his lordship. He's fine." The first spoonful Elaine gave him only contained tiny glass shards. Apart from a small cut on his lip, nothing else happened to him. "And what about Elaine Durand?" Holmes wanted to know. Eddy looked Holmes straight in the eyes. "She's dead. Inspector Wolford shot her when she tried to fire at Lord Greenwich. If you hadn't stepped in so bravely and struck her so decisively, as Lord Greenwich told us, he likely wouldn't be here anymore." Holmes wanted to know more, but Alice told him to be quiet. Only a "well done, Eddy" escaped his lips before Holmes wearily closed his eyes again. His thoughts drifted back to times past, when he too had once awakened in hospital to find his friend Dr. Watson lying beside him, bandaged and in plaster. Now he, Sherlock, was old and alone, and Dr. Watson was no longer by his side. You were listening to Charles Fraser, Death on Christmas Day. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 2. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production.